What was the most secret and complex military operation in history? Story 1. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a secret military operation. It was more like an entire hidden world running parallel to normal life. Because while World War II was unfolding publicly, there was this massive coordinated effort happening in the background that most people, even many involved in it, didn't fully understand. At its peak, it employed over 100,000 people. Entire cities like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge were built almost from nothing, heavily guarded, isolated, and compartmentalized, so that information was split into pieces, meaning most workers only knew a tiny fraction of what they were actually contributing to. And that's what made it so effective. Not just secrecy at the top, but secrecy built into the structure itself. Scientists, engineers, military personnel, all working on different parts of the same problem without seeing the full picture, which allowed something incredibly complex to develop without the whole thing being exposed, which is where the scale starts to feel almost unreal. Because this wasn't just research, it was industrial, logistical, scientific, and military coordination all happening at once, under extreme time pressure, with the outcome being something that had never existed before. At the same time, it wasn't invisible forever. Once the atomic bombs were used, the existence of the project became known, and the impact was immediate and global. Still, it sticks as one of the most secret and complex operations ever, because it shows how something enormous can exist in plain sight, as long as the structure is designed to keep people from seeing the whole. And once you realize how many moving parts were involved, it's hard not to wonder how something that big stayed hidden as long as it did. Story 2. I've always been fascinated by Operation Ivy Bells because it sounds less like a real military mission and more like something straight out of a spy thriller, except it actually happened. The idea alone is wild, using submarines and specially trained divers to sneak into the Sea of Okhotsk, which the Soviets considered basically their own secure backyard, and physically attach a wiretap to an undersea communication cable. And it wasn't just a one-and-done mission either. That's what makes it even crazier. They had to go back, retrieve the recordings, and then reinstall or replace the device so they could keep monitoring communications over time without being detected. All of that happening underwater, in hostile territory, during the Cold War, where getting caught would have been a massive international incident. What really makes it stand out is how precise and quiet everything had to be. There's no margin for error when you're operating at those depths, with that level of secrecy, relying on equipment and coordination that has to work perfectly every single time. One mistake and the whole operation is blown. It's just such a perfect example of how far intelligence operations will go. Not just gathering information, but doing it in a way that's almost absurdly complex and risky, all just to listen in on conversations happening miles away. Story 3. Operation Neptune Spear is one of those missions that almost sounds too cinematic to be real, but the level of planning and precision behind it was insane. After years of intelligence gathering, tracking, and piecing together fragments of information, the US finally identified a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan that might be hiding Osama bin Laden. And even then, it wasn't 100% confirmed. They were operating with a lot of uncertainty. The actual raid itself was incredibly high risk. A team of Navy SEALs flew in on stealth helicopters deep into Pakistani territory without informing the Pakistani government, which alone could have caused a massive geopolitical crisis if something went wrong. Then one of the helicopters crash-landed inside the compound, which could have completely derailed the mission, but they adapted on the fly and kept going. From there, it was all about speed and coordination. Clearing the compound, identifying targets, and confirming bin Laden's identity, all in a matter of minutes. They had to get in, complete the objective, gather intelligence, and get out before anyone could respond. What really makes it stand out is how many things could have gone wrong at every stage. Intelligence failure, detection, mechanical issues, political fallout, and yet it still came together. It's one of those operations where planning, training, and execution all had to align almost perfectly under extreme pressure. Story 4. Operation Mincemeat is one of those operations that sounds completely absurd until you realize it actually worked, and worked incredibly well. The British basically staged an elaborate deception by using a dead body, dressing him up as a Royal Marine officer, and planting fake documents on him that suggested the Allies were planning to invade Greece instead of Sicily. Then they made sure the body would be accidentally discovered by the Spanish, knowing the information would likely make its way to the Germans. What makes it so fascinating is how detailed everything was. This wasn't just stick some papers in a pocket and hope for the best. They built an entire fake identity for the man, down to personal letters, receipts, even small emotional details to make it feel real if anyone looked closely. The level of psychological planning behind it is kind of insane. They weren't just forging documents, they were crafting a believable human life. And somehow, it worked. The Germans bought it and shifted attention and resources away from Sicily, which helped the actual Allied invasion succeed with less resistance. It's just such a perfect example of how intelligence work isn't always about brute force or advanced tech. Sometimes it's about understanding how people think and exploiting that in the most creative, borderline unbelievable ways. Story 5. In recent history, I'd have to go with Operation Spiderweb, because it's one of those modern operations that shows just how layered and complex things have become, even if we only know part of the story. And that's kind of the key point. The fact that we do know about it at all probably means there's a lot more behind the scenes that hasn't been revealed yet. That's what makes recent operations interesting compared to older ones like World War II or Cold War missions. Back then, decades pass and you eventually get the full picture. Now, you're usually only seeing fragments, the parts that are allowed to be public, while the most sensitive details stay buried. So, even something already considered complex is probably just the surface. With something like this, it's not just one action or one clever trick. It's layers of intelligence gathering, coordination across agencies, timing, and likely a mix of cyber, surveillance, and human elements all working together. Modern operations tend to be less about a single dramatic moment and more about a long chain of interconnected moves that all have to line up perfectly. It's also a reminder that the most complex operations are probably the ones we don't know about yet, or won't know about for years. The ones that get talked about are already filtered versions of what actually happened, which makes you wonder how much more is going on behind the curtain. Story 6. If you're stretching the definition of secret to include large-scale surprise, then Operation Barbarossa definitely deserves to be in the conversation, just for the sheer scale and the element of shock involved. It was the largest military invasion in history. Millions of troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, all launched in a massive, coordinated push against the Soviet Union. And yeah, it wasn't secret in the same way as a covert spy mission, but the level of surprise still played a huge role. Despite warnings and intelligence signals, the USSR wasn't fully prepared for the timing and scale of the Humla, which made the initial phase devastating. That kind of strategic surprise on that scale is honestly hard to even imagine. What makes it so complex isn't just the numbers, but the logistics behind it. Coordinating an operation across such a massive front, supplying troops, managing communication, and maintaining momentum, it's an enormous undertaking, even by today's standards. Everything had to align at once, and for a while, it actually worked in Germany's favor because of how overwhelming the initial strike was. It's a good example of how complex doesn't always mean hidden or covert. Sometimes it's about the scale, coordination, and the ability to catch an opponent off guard, even if the operation itself isn't secret in the traditional sense. Story 7, if you really lean into the secret aspect, then Operation Anadir is a great pick, because the level of deception involved was honestly insane. The Soviets managed to secretly move nuclear missiles, troops, and equipment all the way to Cuba, while disguising it as something completely routine. They use misleading paperwork, strict operational security, even having troops wear winter gear on ships to sell the idea they were heading somewhere cold. And for a while, it worked. The US didn't fully realize what was happening until reconnaissance flights revealed the missile sites, which is what kicked off the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's one of those operations where the secrecy wasn't just about hiding information. It was about actively shaping what the other side thought was happening. That kind of large-scale misdirection is incredibly hard to pull off. And then you've got Attack on Pearl Harbor, which is a different kind of secret, more about surprise than long-term concealment. The Japanese managed to plan and execute a massive coordinated strike across the Pacific, moving an entire carrier fleet into position without being detected, and hitting a major military base with almost no warning. Both are good examples of how secrecy can mean different things, either hiding a buildup in plain sight like Anadir, or delivering a sudden, devastating surprise like Pearl Harbor. Either way, pulling it off at that scale takes an incredible amount of coordination and precision. Story 8. If you're talking about Operation Hydra, it's a really interesting example because it sits somewhere between a covert strike and a highly coordinated strategic bombing mission. It was part of Operation Crossbow during World War II, and the goal was to cripple the German Was-2 rocket program by hitting the research facility at Peenemünde. What made it complex wasn't just the target, but the precision and planning involved. The Allies had to gather intelligence on a secret weapons program, identify key scientists, facilities, and production areas, and then plan a night bombing raid that could actually hit those specific targets. This wasn't just bomb the area, it was layered targeting, trying to disrupt development, kill key personnel, and slow down production all at once. They even staggered the bombing waves to focus on different parts of the facility, including living quarters, which shows how calculated it was. The idea was to create maximum disruption, not just physical damage, but also chaos in the program itself. And it worked, at least partially. It delayed the V2 program and forced the Germans to move production elsewhere, which complicated their efforts significantly. It's a good reminder that secret and complex doesn't always mean silent or invisible. Sometimes it's about taking hidden intelligence and turning it into a highly targeted, coordinated strike with very specific objectives. Story 9. Project Azorian is one of those operations that sounds completely unbelievable until you realize it actually happened. And it's easily one of the most insane Cold War missions ever attempted. The CIA basically tried to recover a sunken Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of meters down, which is already crazy enough, but the way they did it is what makes it next level. They built an entire fake deep-sea mining operation as cover, complete with a massive ship, the Glomar Explorer, supposedly designed to harvest minerals from the ocean floor. In reality, it was a front for a highly classified recovery mission. Underneath the ship was this giant claw-like mechanism that could descend miles down and grab sections of the submarine. The goal wasn't just the sub itself, it was everything inside it. Nuclear missiles, code books, encryption tech, basically a treasure trove of Soviet military secrets. And they had to do all of this without tipping off the Soviets, because if they found out, it could have caused a massive international incident. Even then, things didn't go perfectly. Part of the submarine broke off during the lift, so they only recovered a section of it, but the fact they even managed to pull anything up from that depth in the 1970s is kind of mind-blowing. It's just such a perfect mix of engineering, espionage, and deception. The kind of operation that sounds like fiction, but was very real and ridiculously ambitious. Story 10. Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a really interesting case because it's not secret in the covert ops sense, but in terms of complexity and sheer execution, it's kind of unbelievable. The French set up a fortified base in a remote valley in Vietnam, thinking it would draw out and crush the Viet Minh in a conventional battle. On paper, it looked like they had the advantage. What they didn't expect was how far the Viet Minh would go to turn the situation around. They managed to haul heavy artillery through dense jungle and mountains, piece by piece, often by hand or bicycle, and position it on the high ground overlooking the French base. That alone is insane from a logistics standpoint. Then they dug extensive trench systems, slowly closing in on the French positions over time. Instead of a quick, decisive battle, it turned into a siege. The French were trapped in the valley, constantly under bombardment, while their supply lines were cut off. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh kept tightening the noose with coordinated attacks and relentless pressure. It's one of those operations where the brilliance wasn't in secrecy, but in preparation, logistics, and completely outmaneuvering an opponent who thought they controlled the situation. The result was a decisive defeat for the French and a turning point in the First Indochina War, showing that strategy and determination can outweigh even significant technological and positional advantages. Story 11. Operation Desert Storm is a great example of how modern military operations shifted into something insanely coordinated and technology-driven, even if it wasn't secret in the traditional sense. What made it stand out was how many moving parts were working together at once. Air, land, sea, and even early cyber/electronic warfare elements, all synchronized at a scale that hadn't really been seen before. The air campaign alone was massive. Coalition forces spent weeks systematically taking out Iraqi air defenses, communication systems, and infrastructure, basically dismantling their ability to respond before the ground war even started. It wasn't just bombing randomly, it was targeted, phased, and designed to cripple command and control from the top down. Then came the ground offensive, which is where the real complexity showed. Instead of a straightforward frontal assault, coalition forces pulled off the famous left hook, sweeping around Iraqi forces through the desert and hitting them from the side and rear. It happened so fast that a lot of Iraqi units were overwhelmed before they could even react properly. What makes it so notable is how quickly it all unfolded once it started. After all that buildup, the ground war was over in just about 100 hours. That kind of speed doesn't happen without an insane amount of planning, coordination, and technological advantage behind the scenes. It's a good example of how complexity in modern warfare isn't always about secrecy. It's about precision, timing, and integrating multiple systems so well that the opponent can't keep up. Story 12. Operation Eagle Claw is a perfect example of how something can be insanely complex even if it ultimately fails. The mission itself, a U.S. attempt to rescue hostages from Iran in 1980, required an almost ridiculous level of coordination across multiple phases, locations, and units. They weren't just flying in and grabbing people. The plan involved staging in the desert, linking up helicopters with transport aircraft at a remote location, Desert 1, refueling in the middle of nowhere, then moving closer to Tehran, hiding during the day, and finally launching the rescue mission the next night. Every step depended on the previous one going perfectly, and that's where things started to fall apart. Mechanical failures, dust storms, those massive haboobs, and communication issues reduced the number of operational helicopters below the minimum needed to continue. At that point, the mission had to be aborted. Then during the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a transport aircraft, causing an explosion that killed 8 servicemen. What really stands out is how fragile the whole operation was. It was like a chain where if one link failed, everything unraveled, and that's exactly what happened. Even though it didn't succeed, it exposed just how difficult these kinds of long-range, multi-branch special operations are, and it directly led to major changes in how the U.S. military plans and executes missions today. Story 13. Operation Wrath of God, often informally referred to as Operation Bayonet, is one of those operations that's less about a single event and more about a long, shadowy campaign that stretched over years. After the Munich Olympics attack in 1972, Israel launched a covert effort to track down and eliminate those responsible, and what followed was basically a global manhunt carried out in total secrecy. What makes it so complex is that it wasn't one mission. It was dozens of small, highly coordinated operations across different countries, each with its own planning, surveillance, and execution. Agents had to identify targets, confirm identities, avoid collateral damage, and then get in and out without being caught, often in hostile or foreign environments where one mistake could spark a diplomatic crisis. There was also a huge intelligence component behind it. Finding these individuals wasn't straightforward. It required networks of informants, long-term tracking, and constant verification. And even then, things didn't always go perfectly, like the Lillehammer affair, where a mistaken identity led to the killing of an innocent man, which shows just how high stakes and uncertain these operations were. It's a very different kind of complex compared to large military invasions. It's slower, quieter, and way more dependent on precision and patience. Instead of one big moment, it's a series of calculated moves happening over time, mostly out of public view, which honestly makes it even more intense in its own way. Story 14. Operation Ivy Bells is one of those operations that almost feels unreal because of how precise and risky it was. During the Cold War, the US managed to sneak into the Sea of Okhotsk, which the Soviets basically considered secure territory, and physically tap an underwater communication cable carrying military messages. And this wasn't just dropping some device and leaving. Submarines had to get into position without being detected. Divers had to go down in freezing high-pressure conditions, locate the exact cable, and install a tap that could record conversations without interrupting the signal or tipping anyone off. That alone is insanely difficult. What makes it even crazier is that it was an ongoing operation. They didn't just set it up once, they had to come back periodically to retrieve the recordings and replace or maintain the device, all while staying completely undetected. Every trip carried the same risk of being discovered in what was essentially enemy-controlled waters. The level of engineering, stealth, and coordination required is just ridiculous. One mistake, one piece of equipment failing, one detection, and it could have turned into a massive international incident. It's such a perfect example of Cold War espionage at its peak. Not flashy, not loud, but incredibly sophisticated and high stakes behind the scenes. Story 15. Operation Entebbe, also known as Operation Thunderbolt, is one of those missions that feels almost impossible on paper, but somehow actually worked. The situation started with a hijacked Air France flight that ended up in Entebbe, Uganda, with hostages being held under the protection of a hostile regime. Israel decided to attempt a rescue from over 4,000 kilometers away, which already sounds insane from a logistics standpoint. The level of planning behind it was ridiculous. They had to gather intelligence on the airport layout, the number and position of terrorists, Ugandan troops, and even details like where the hostages were being held inside the terminal. Then they flew transport planes at low altitude for hours to avoid radar detection, basically threading the needle across multiple countries. And then there's the part that always stands out. They used a black Mercedes to mimic the car of Uganda's leader, hoping to get close to the terminal without raising suspicion. It's such a small but clever detail in a mission that depended on surprise and speed. Once on the ground, everything had to happen fast. The commandos stormed the terminal, eliminated the hijackers, secured the hostages, and got out before Ugandan forces could mount a serious response. The whole raid was over in under an hour. It's one of those operations where distance, timing, deception, and precision all had to line up perfectly, and the fact that it succeeded makes it one of the most impressive rescue missions ever carried out. Story 16. Stuxnet is honestly one of the most insane operations ever carried out, because it completely changed what people thought warfare could even look like. Instead of bombs or troops, this was a cyber weapon designed to physically damage infrastructure, specifically targeting Iran's nuclear program. What makes it so complex is how precise it was. It didn't just spread randomly like normal malware, it was engineered to infiltrate very specific industrial control systems. the kind that managed things like centrifuges used in uranium enrichment. It even used multiple zero-day exploits to get in, which is already rare on its own, let alone several in one piece of code. And then once it got inside, it didn't just shut things down. It subtly altered how the machines operated, causing them to spin at incorrect speeds while feeding normal readings back to operators. So, everything looked fine while the equipment was literally destroying itself. That level of deception inside a system is wild. It also had to jump an air gap, meaning it spread via physical devices like USB drives to reach systems not connected to the internet, which adds another layer of difficulty in planning. It's one of those operations where the complexity isn't just in execution, but in design, stealth, and long-term impact. No explosions, no headlines at first, but it quietly caused real-world damage in a way that hadn't really been seen before. Story 17. Operation Overlord is probably the ultimate example of a military operation being both massive and incredibly complex, even if it wasn't secret in the strict sense. The scale alone is hard to wrap your head around. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships and aircraft, all coordinated for a single invasion across the English Channel. But what really makes it stand out is the level of deception and planning behind it. The Allies didn't just prepare for the invasion, they ran an entire parallel operation to convince the Germans it would happen somewhere else, mainly at Pas-de-Calais. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, even double agents feeding misinformation, all designed to keep German forces in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then there's the logistics. Getting that many troops, vehicles, and supplies onto heavily defended beaches required insane coordination. They even built temporary harbors, the mulberries, and laid underwater pipelines to supply fuel after the landing because they knew they couldn't rely on capturing ports immediately. And everything had to line up perfectly. Tides, weather, timing, coordination between air, sea, and land forces. A delay or misstep could have been catastrophic. It's one of those operations where complexity comes from every angle, scale, deception, engineering, and timing, all working together. Even though the invasion itself was visible to the world, the preparation behind it was a masterpiece of planning. Story 18. Honestly, Operation Uranus absolutely deserves to buzz in the conversation. It's one of the most brilliantly executed and complex operations of World War II, and it's kind of surprising people don't bring it up more. What makes it so impressive isn't just the scale, but the strategy behind it. While the Germans were fully focused on taking Stalingrad, the Soviets planned a massive counteroffensive that targeted the weaker Axis forces on the flanks, mainly Romanian units, instead of hitting the strongest German positions head-on. That alone shows a huge level of strategic thinking, and the coordination was insane. Multiple Soviet fronts launched simultaneous attacks from the north and south, punching through those weaker lines and then rapidly advancing to encircle the German Sixth Army. Within days, they closed the gap and trapped hundreds of thousands of troops inside Stalingrad. What really stands out is the element of deception and buildup. The Soviets managed to amass huge numbers of troops and equipment without the Germans fully grasping what was coming. By the time it started, it was already too late to react effectively. It completely flipped the situation. What looked like a German victory in Stalingrad suddenly turned into one of their worst defeats. It's the kind of operation where timing, intelligence, misdirection, and execution all lined up perfectly, and the impact was massive, not just tactically, but for the entire course of the war. Story 19. Operation Bagration is honestly one of the most underrated massive operations in World War II, especially considering how devastating and complex it was. It doesn't get talked about as much as D-Day, but in terms of scale and impact, it was just as insane, if not more in some ways. The Soviets launched it in 1944 against German Army Group Center, and what makes it stand out is how well everything was coordinated. This wasn't just a brute force push. It was a carefully planned, multi-front offensive that combined deception, overwhelming force, and precise timing. The Soviets used maskirovka, deception tactics, to make the Germans think the main attack would come from somewhere else. So when it hit, it caught them completely off guard. And the result was catastrophic for Germany. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed, supply lines collapsed, and within weeks, Army Group Center was basically wiped out. We're talking about one of the most complete military destructions in history. The logistics alone are hard to comprehend. Moving that many troops, tanks, artillery, and supplies across such a massive front and coordinating simultaneous breakthroughs that all had to succeed together. It wasn't just about pushing forward, it was about breaking the entire structure of the German defenses at once. It's one of those operations where everything aligned: planning, deception, scale, and execution, and the outcome completely reshaped the Eastern Front. Story 20. Operation Gunnerside is one of those operations that feels almost unbelievable when you look at how it was actually pulled off. During World War II, a small team of Norwegian commandos was sent to sabotage a German-controlled heavy water plant in Vemork, which was crucial for Germany's nuclear research program. What makes it so insane is how they got there and what they had to deal with. These guys parachuted into occupied Norway, linked up with another team that had been surviving out in the wilderness, and then had to trek through brutal winter conditions just to reach the target. We're talking freezing temperatures, rough terrain, and constant risk of being discovered. And then instead of a big, loud attack, they went in quietly. They infiltrated the facility, planted explosives on the key equipment, and got out without raising the alarm in time for the Germans to stop them. No massive firefight, no dramatic standoff, just precision and stealth. The impact was huge because it significantly disrupted Germany's ability to produce heavy water, which was important for their nuclear ambitions. And the craziest part? Most of the team escaped afterward, navigating the same harsh environment to get to safety. It's such a perfect example of how a small, highly trained group, with the right planning and execution, can have a massive strategic impact without needing a huge force. Story 21, the Trojan Horse is kind of the original covert operation, even if it comes from mythology rather than confirmed history. The whole idea is just pure psychological warfare. Instead of breaking into the city of Troy by force after years of fighting, the Greeks tricked them into opening the gates themselves. They built this massive wooden horse, pretended to abandon the battlefield, and left it behind as a supposed offering. The Trojans brought it inside their city as a symbol of victory, not realizing it was filled with Greek soldiers hiding inside. Then at night, those soldiers came out, opened the gates, and let the rest of the army in, basically ending the war in one move. What makes it so interesting is that it's not about strength or numbers, it's about understanding how the enemy thinks and using that against them. The Greeks didn't win by overpowering Troy directly, they won by manipulating their perception of reality. Even if parts of the story are exaggerated or symbolic, the concept stuck around for a reason. It's become the blueprint for deception tactics, tricking the opponent into letting their guard down instead of trying to break through it. It's kind of wild that one of the most famous operations ever is built entirely on the idea that sometimes the smartest move isn't force, it's making your enemy defeat themselves. Story 22, Operation Aiche, Operation Oak, is one of those missions that feels almost unreal because of how bold and precise it was. In 1943, after Benito Mussolini was deposed and imprisoned by his own government, the Germans decided to pull off a rescue, not from some Abuchni prison, but from a heavily guarded hotel sitting on top of a mountain at the Gran Sasso. What makes it crazy is how they actually did it. Instead of a traditional assault, they used gliders to silently land troops right next to the hotel. No warning, no buildup, just suddenly German commandos appearing out of nowhere at a location that was supposed to be nearly impossible to reach. The element of surprise was everything. The operation itself was incredibly fast. They overwhelmed the guards without a major firefight, secured Mussolini, and then somehow managed to fly him out of there using a small aircraft taking off from rough mountain terrain, which sounds like something that shouldn't even be possible. It's one of those missions where everything had to go perfectly. Timing, coordination, piloting, surprise, because if any part failed, there was no easy fallback. What really stands out is how a relatively small force, using speed and shock instead of sheer brute strength, managed to pull off something that looked completely out of reach, both physically and strategically. Story 23, Operation Fortitude South, is one of the best examples of deception being just as powerful as actual force. It was part of the broader deception strategy leading up to D-Day, and the goal was simple in theory, but insanely complex in execution. Convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. And the way they did it was honestly kind of genius. They created an entirely fake army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly led by George S. Patton, who the Germans saw as one of the Allies' top commanders. That alone made the threat feel real. Then they backed it up with fake radio traffic, dummy equipment like inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft, and double agents feeding confirmed intelligence to the Germans. It wasn't just about fooling them once either. They had to maintain the illusion before and after D-Day. Even after the Normandy landings began, the Germans hesitated to fully commit their reserves because they believed a larger invasion was still coming at Calais. That delay made a huge difference. What makes it so impressive is how many layers were involved: intelligence, psychology, physical deception, and timing, all working together to shape the enemy's decisions without firing a shot. It's one of those operations where nothing explodes, nothing dramatic happens on the surface, but the impact is massive because it changes how the entire battle unfolds behind the scenes. Story 24, Operation Anthropoid, is one of those operations that's both incredibly precise and incredibly brutal in its consequences. It was the mission to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, one of the highest-ranking German officials and a key architect of the Holocaust, right in the middle of occupied Prague. What makes it stand out is how targeted it was. This wasn't a battlefield operation. It was a small team of trained operatives parachuted into occupied territory, tasked with taking out a single, heavily protected individual. They had to gather intel, track his movements, and pick the right moment to strike in a city crawling with German forces. The actual attack was messy and tense. Their initial plan didn't go perfectly, but they adapted in the moment, using a modified explosive to fatally wound Heydrich. It wasn't some clean cinematic hit, it was chaotic and risky, and it could have failed at multiple points. And then came the aftermath, which is what really shows the stakes. The Germans responded with brutal reprisals, destroying entire villages like Lidice and killing thousands. That part makes the operation feel heavy, because even though it achieved its objective, the cost was enormous. It's one of those missions where the complexity isn't just in planning and execution, but in the political and human consequences that follow. Story 25, Project Iceworm, is one of those operations that sounds almost ridiculous in scale, like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it was a very real Cold War plan. The idea was to build a massive network of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet to secretly store and launch nuclear missiles, all hidden beneath the ice where they'd be nearly impossible to detect. What makes it so crazy is that this wasn't just a concept on paper. They actually started testing it with a project called Camp Century. They dug tunnels into the ice, built living quarters, labs, and even installed a portable nuclear reactor to power the whole thing. It was basically an underground base carved into a moving glacier, and that's where the problem comes in. Ice isn't stable. It shifts, compresses, and slowly deforms over time, which made maintaining those tunnels way harder than expected. Structures started warping, collapsing, and needing constant repair. The environment itself was working against them. The plan was to eventually deploy hundreds of missiles across this hidden network, constantly moving them to keep them unpredictable, but the engineering challenges proved too much. The ice just wouldn't cooperate long term. It's such a wild example of Cold War thinking, taking a bold idea, pushing technology to its limits, and trying to turn an entire landscape into a secret nuclear launch system. Story 26. Operation Gold is one of those Cold War espionage operations that's almost absurd in how ambitious it was. The CIA and British intelligence basically decided to dig a tunnel under Berlin to tap into Soviet landline communications, not metaphorically, literally digging underground from West Berlin into the Soviet sector. What makes it so wild is the scale and secrecy. This wasn't a quick job. It took months of covert construction, moving dirt without raising suspicion, and building a fully functional listening station underground. The goal was to intercept high-level Soviet military and government communications, which meant the payoff could be huge if it worked. And it did work for a while. They were able to listen in on a ton of conversations and gather valuable intelligence. But here's the twist that makes it even more interesting. The Soviets actually knew about the tunnel almost from the start because of a mole, George Blake, who had tipped them off. Instead of shutting it down immediately, they let it run to protect their source, feeding mostly low-value or controlled information through the lines. Eventually, they discovered the tunnel publicly, turning it into a propaganda win. It's such a perfect Cold War story, layers of secrecy, deception on both sides, and the realization that even when you think you've pulled off something incredibly complex, the other side might already be playing along. Story 27. Operation Washtub is one of those lesser-known Cold War operations that's wild once you realize what the plan actually was. The US was worried about the possibility of a Soviet-backed invasion in Central America, so they set up secret stay-behind networks in places like Nicaragua, basically sleeper resistance groups that would activate if a takeover happened. What makes it interesting is that this wasn't about immediate action. It was long-term planning for a worst-case scenario that might never even happen. They recruited and trained locals, hid weapons and supplies in remote caches, and built up a covert infrastructure that could support guerrilla-style resistance if the region fell under communist control. So, instead of a dramatic one-time mission, it was more like planting the seeds for a future conflict that they hoped would never come. Everything had to stay completely hidden, because if it was exposed, it could have caused serious political fallout. It's a different kind of complex, less about a single high-risk operation and more about patience, secrecy, and preparation over time. The kind of thing that sits quietly in the background, only becoming relevant if everything goes wrong. It's also a good reminder that during the Cold War, a lot of effort went into planning for scenarios that never actually happened, but still required a huge amount of coordination and trust to set up. Story 28, the golf ball grenade idea sounds like one of those weird military myths, but it actually ties back to real attempts to disguise explosives as everyday objects for covert use. The concept is pretty straightforward. Make something small, round, and completely unremarkable so it doesn't raise suspicion, and you've got a device that can be carried or placed without drawing attention. During different periods, especially in intelligence and special operations, there were experiments with disguised explosives, everything from pens to radios to ordinary household items. The idea was always the same: blend in, avoid detection, and strike when least expected. A golf ball is kind of the perfect shape for that: small, portable, and something nobody would think twice about seeing. That said, a lot of what people talk about specifically with golf ball grenades tends to be exaggerated or more in the realm of rumor than widely documented standardized equipment. It fits the pattern of real covert design principles, but it's not like it was a common, issued weapon. It's one of those things where reality and myth blur together a bit, because the idea is absolutely consistent with how covert tools are designed, even if the specific version people imagine isn't as widely confirmed or used as people think. Story 29, PHASR, is one of those projects that sounds straight out of sci-fi, but it was actually a real non-lethal weapon concept developed by the US military. The idea wasn't to kill or permanently injure, but to temporarily disorient or stop a person using laser-based technology. What makes it interesting is how it worked. Instead of firing bullets, it used a laser designed to cause intense glare and disorientation, essentially overwhelming a person's vision for a short time. The goal was crowd control, or stopping individuals without resorting to lethal force. It even got attention because of concerns around blinding laser weapons, which are restricted under international agreements. So, the system had to be specifically designed to avoid causing permanent eye damage, which adds another layer of complexity. It's a good example of how modern military tech isn't always about more destructive power. Sometimes it's about control, precision, and finding ways to neutralize a threat without escalating to deadly force. Even though it never became widely deployed, it shows the kind of direction research was going, blending optics, human physiology, and tactical needs into something that feels more like future warfare than traditional combat. Story 30, the CornerShot system, is one of those designs that makes you go, why didn't someone think of this sooner? Because it solves a really specific but very real problem: seeing and shooting around corners without exposing yourself. At its core, it's a weapon platform with a hinged front section that can literally bend to the side, usually up to about 60 degrees. There's a camera and screen setup, so the operator can stay safely behind cover while aiming and firing. It's not about more firepower, it's about survivability and positioning, especially in urban combat where corners and tight spaces are everywhere. And then you've got versions that can mount things beyond just a handgun, including grenade launchers or other attachments, which takes it from a niche tool to something with a lot more tactical flexibility. Being able to deploy that kind of firepower without stepping into a line of sight is a huge advantage in the right scenario. What makes it interesting is how it blends relatively simple mechanics with modern tech like cameras and displays. It's not some futuristic laser weapon, it's a practical solution to a very human problem. I don't want to get shot while checking what's around that corner. It's a great example of how some of the most clever military innovations aren't about bigger or faster, but about changing the angle, literally, to reduce risk and gain an edge. Story 31, the active denial system, is one of those concepts that sounds almost fictional until you realize it's very real and actually works in a pretty unsettling way. It's a non-lethal weapon designed for crowd control, but instead of bullets or tear gas, it uses millimeter wave radiation to create an intense heating sensation on the skin. Basically, it sends out a focused beam that penetrates just a tiny fraction of a millimeter into the skin and rapidly heats it, triggering an immediate "get away from this" response. People describe it like suddenly touching a hot surface, except there's nothing visible causing it. The effect stops almost instantly once you're out of the beam, which is why it's considered non-lethal. What makes it interesting is that it's not meant to injure, it's meant to compel behavior. It gives operators a way to disperse crowds or stop individuals without lasting physical harm, at least in theory. But obviously, something that causes that kind of intense sensation raises a lot of ethical and practical questions about how it could be used. It's a good example of how modern military tech is exploring ways to control situations without escalating to lethal force, but also how those same tools can feel pretty dystopian depending on how you look at them. Story 32. The digital revolver idea pops up a lot in discussions about modern warfare, but it's more of a concept or nickname than a widely recognized, standardized weapon system. It usually refers to the idea of delivering multiple precise effects from a single platform, kind of like how a revolver cycles through different rounds, but in a digital or modular way. In some contexts, people use it to describe weapons or systems that can switch between different types of payloads or targeting modes, like kinetic, electronic, or cyber effects, depending on the situation. So, Instead of carrying multiple specialized tools, you have one system that can adapt on the fly. It also ties into the broader trend of digitization in military tech, where targeting, control, and coordination are increasingly software-driven. That means faster decision-making, more precise engagement, and the ability to integrate with other systems in real time. But unlike something like the CornerShot or the active denial system, this isn't a clearly defined, widely deployed piece of equipment. It's more of an idea that reflects where technology is heading rather than a specific tool you can point to. So, it's one of those terms that sounds cool and futuristic, but when you dig into it, it's less about a single device and more about a shift in how modern weapon systems are designed and used. Story 33. The railgun is one of those weapons that sounds like pure sci-fi, but it's very real, and the concept behind it is actually pretty simple, at least on paper. Instead of using gunpowder or explosives to fire a projectile, it uses electromagnetic force to accelerate a metal slug to insanely high speeds. We're talking velocities so high that the projectile doesn't even need an explosive warhead. The sheer kinetic energy on impact does the damage. That means fewer explosives to store, potentially longer range, and way faster travel times compared to traditional artillery. What makes it complex is everything around that idea. Generating and controlling the massive amounts of Akarbah needed to fire it is a huge challenge. The rails themselves wear down quickly because of the extreme forces and heat, so durability becomes a major issue. And then there's the whole integration problem, fitting something like this onto ships or platforms that can actually support it. It's one of those technologies that shows a lot of promise, especially for naval use, but has struggled to move from experimental to practical because of those engineering hurdles. Still, it's a great example of how modern weapons development is pushing into areas that feel less like traditional warfare and more like applied physics experiments turned into real systems. Story 34. Quantum stealth is one of those things that sounds insanely futuristic, like straight-up invisibility cloaks, but the reality is a lot more grounded and a lot more debated. The idea behind it is using special materials to bend light around an object, making it harder to see, kind of like optical camouflage. The claims around it suggest it can hide people or equipment by redirecting light so that what's behind them becomes visible instead. On paper, that sounds like actual invisibility, but in practice it's more about visual distortion or concealment from certain angles rather than true you can't see anything there invisibility. What makes it tricky is that a lot of the details are either proprietary or not independently verified in a clear scientific way, so it sits in this weird space between real experimental tech and something that gets hyped way beyond what's actually proven. Even in broader research, true invisibility across all angles, lighting conditions, and distances is incredibly difficult because light behaves in complex ways. Bending it perfectly around an object without distortion is a huge challenge. So, it's one of those concepts where the underlying science exists in some form, but the real-world application isn't nearly as clean or magical as people imagine. It's less invisible soldier, and more maybe harder to see under specific conditions, at least for now. Story 35, the tactical assault. Light operator suit is one of those concepts that felt like we were about to get real-life Iron Man suits, but the reality turned out to be way more complicated. It was a US special operations project aimed at creating a powered exoskeleton that could give soldiers enhanced strength, better protection, integrated sensors, and real-time data, basically turning one operator into a super-augmented unit. On paper, it had everything: bullet-resistant armor, heads-up displays, environmental sensors, medical monitoring, even systems that could respond to injuries. The goal was to massively increase survivability and effectiveness in high-risk missions like hostage rescues or urban combat, but the challenges were huge. Power supply was a massive issue. You need something lightweight but strong enough to run all that tech. Mobility was another, Adding armor and systems without slowing the operator down too much is incredibly difficult. And then there's heat, weight, reliability, all the stuff that doesn't show up in concept art but matters in real-world use. In the end, the full suit never became operational, but a lot of the technologies developed for it, sensors, materials, wearable systems, got spun off into other military applications. It's a perfect example of how futuristic ideas push innovation forward, even if the final product doesn't look exactly like what people imagined. Story 36. The idea of sentient unmanned vehicles sounds like we're already in a sci-fi movie, but in reality, it's more about how far autonomy and AI have come in military systems rather than actual thinking machines. These aren't self-aware robots. They're highly advanced drones or vehicles that can operate with increasing levels of independence. What makes them interesting is the shift from remote-controlled to semi-autonomous or even autonomous behavior. Instead of a human controlling every move, these systems can navigate terrain, identify targets, avoid obstacles, and make split-second decisions based on programming and sensor input. That's a huge leap in terms of speed and efficiency. You see this across air, land, and sea, drones that can patrol and strike, unmanned ground vehicles for reconnaissance, and even autonomous naval systems. The complexity comes from integrating sensors, AI models, communication systems, and decision-making frameworks into something that can function reliably in chaotic environments. But the word sentient is where things get misleading. These systems don't have awareness, emotions, or understanding. They're executing algorithms. Still, as they get more capable, the line between tool and independent actor starts to feel a bit blurry, especially in high-stakes situations. It's one of those areas where the technology is advancing fast, and the implications, both strategic and ethical, are still catching up. Story 37. That one sounds completely made up until you realize it's actually true, and it perfectly captures how bizarre Cold War planning could get. The British project, Blue Peacock, was essentially a nuclear landmine designed to be buried in West Germany and detonated if the Soviets invaded, with the goal of contaminating key areas and slowing their advance. And yeah, the chicken part is real. One of the problems they ran into was that the device needed to stay within a certain temperature range to function properly, especially in cold environments. So, at one point they seriously considered putting live chickens inside the casing, with enough food and water so their body heat would keep the electronics warm for several days. It sounds ridiculous, but in a weird way it makes sense. It's a low-tech solution to a very real engineering problem. The fact that it was even proposed shows how far they were willing to go to make the system work under any conditions. The whole concept is kind of insane when you step back though, burying nuclear devices in Allied territory as a defensive measure, knowing the long-term consequences. In the end, the project was scrapped, partly because of how impractical and politically dangerous it was. It's such a perfect example of Cold War thinking. Incredibly advanced technology mixed with surprisingly simple, almost absurd solutions, all aimed at preparing for the worst-case scenario. Story 38. Operation Paul Bunyan is one of those operations that's wild because it wasn't about a long battle or secret infiltration. It was basically a massive, overwhelming show of force over cutting down a tree. The background makes it way more intense. After the Korean axe murder incident, where North Korean soldiers killed 2 US officers who were trying to trim a tree in the DMZ, things escalated fast. The response wasn't subtle at all. Instead of quietly finishing the job later, the US and South Korea decided to make a statement. They sent in a huge force, engineers to cut the tree, backed by hundreds of troops, attack helicopters, bombers on standby, fighter jets overhead, even aircraft carriers positioned nearby. It was basically a full military operation just to remove that tree, but the real goal was deterrence. Everything had to be perfectly coordinated because the risk of escalation was very real. One wrong move, and it could have turned into a direct conflict. But that overwhelming presence made it clear that any interference would be met with immediate force. In the end, they cut the tree down without resistance, and that was the point. It's such a unique example of complexity, not in secrecy or combat, but in controlled escalation, using sheer visible power to achieve an objective without actually firing a shot. Story 39. Operation Paul Bunyan is one of those operations that's wild, because it wasn't about a long battle or secret infiltration. It was basically a massive, overwhelming show of force over cutting down a tree. The background makes it way more intense. After the Korean axe murder incident, where North Korean soldiers killed 2 US officers who were trying to trim a tree in the DMZ, things escalated fast. The response wasn't subtle at all. Instead of quietly finishing the job later, the US and South Korea decided to make a statement. They sent in a huge force, engineers to cut the tree, backed by hundreds of troops, attack helicopters, bombers on standby, fighter jets overhead, even aircraft carriers positioned nearby. It was basically a full military operation just to remove that tree, but the real goal was deterrence. Everything had to be perfectly coordinated because the risk of escalation was very real. One wrong move, and it could have turned into a direct conflict. But that overwhelming presence made it clear that any interference would be met with immediate force. In the end, they cut the tree down without resistance, and that was the point. It's such a unique example of complexity, not in secrecy or combat, but in controlled escalation, using sheer visible power to achieve an objective without actually firing a shot. Story 40. Operation Gladio is one of those operations that feels less like a single mission and more like a hidden system running in the background for decades. It was a network of stay-behind forces set up across Western Europe during the Cold War, meant to activate if a Soviet invasion happened, basically underground resistance groups ready to operate behind enemy lines. What makes it so complex is that it wasn't confined to one country. It stretched across multiple nations, coordinated through NATO-linked structures with secret arms caches, trained operatives, and contingency plans that were never supposed to be used unless everything went wrong. It required long-term secrecy, coordination between intelligence agencies, and trust that these networks would stay hidden and functional over time. But what really makes it controversial is what came out later. There were allegations and investigations suggesting that parts of these networks may have been involved in internal political manipulation or even violent incidents during peacetime, which blurred the line between defense planning and interference. Not everything is fully clear or agreed upon, but it added a whole other layer of complexity to what was already a secretive operation. It's a different kind of secret and complex, not a dramatic raid or battle, but a decades-long shadow infrastructure built for a scenario that never fully happened and only partially revealed years later.